WARCRY, Part 3, by Christopher James Loosely, 2 months before the War of the Gods. Taldir and the mage sat in a dingy cell. They did not know where they were being kept, nor how long it had been since they were first captured. They could not count each sunrise, not without a single window to allow them such a thing. Their guards rarely spoke, giving them no indication of how long their shifts were, let alone how long they'd been held in such a squalid place. They were at least fed every day, at least they hoped it was every day. It had become so difficult to tell, although the term food was being generous for what they were given. Sometimes they were even granted crusts of bread, the last scratches of meat from the bone. However, more often than not, they were gifted a vile concoction in their bowls, which the two could barely stomach, whilst praying to the gods that it was stew. Under the pale glint of the sconces, the pair showed ever-growing signs of their malnourishment. Taldir's skin had begun to grey and crack, his sapphire-blue eyes had lost their lustre, and his blonde hair had been browned and muddied. The mage wasn't much better off, with his perfectly groomed goatee having overgrown into a gnarled mess, with his own eyes having lost their gleam. Both had lost a considerable amount of weight, with visible cheekbones, spines and ribs, where youthful muscle had once been. They had not set eyes upon Aris since the tower. Were they even still at the tower? Were they still in Azora? Or had they been taken to Azin's realm? What had they done to the mighty Aris? Both knew that he had no information that could be forced out of him, nothing of real value to be gained from his capture. But then there was something in Varanus' eyes whilst the two were fighting, something that saw more than what simply lay before him. However, any intrigue from that night had faded over time, along with their will to live, both starting to wonder what it was that was keeping them going. The lock of the prison door clanged, and the creak of the heavy wooden door jogged the pair out of their listless, death-like state. Their eyes turned to the figure who was entering, a figure whose presence gripped them with a terror that they had not felt since the tower. It was Varanus, his purple and gold armor being unmistakable, his violet eyes flickering against the soft flames that peppered the room. His grey skin now had a purple hue to it, which they did not recall from their last encounter. This time his hair draped elegantly down his back and in front of his shoulders. Had it not been for the markings on his face, he could have been considered beautiful. Varanus wore a slight smile on his face as his eyes met the prisoners', the clinking of chains sounding behind him. Their gazes widened in horror as Aris plodded slowly into the room. Strikes from a whip had torn his flesh in 100 places, whilst the wounds from stabs, cuts and beatings covered 100 more. He had been stripped to his breeches, fully displaying the horror of his torture. Taldir could see that ribs had been broken, and possibly his left arm, too. His body was weak, nearly half the size it had once been, but even then, he cut an imposing figure. But his eyes were to the floor, perhaps unwilling to look up after his failure. Aris was led to the far wall of the prison, directly in front of Taldir and the mage, with Varanus gesturing at the 2 guards. "I want him chained up there," he said with a calm authority. However, the guards looked fearful at Aris, no doubt hearing of his attack on the camp in Icaria. Varanus' eyes narrowed, his voice becoming sharper. Is he more frightening than me? He hissed, sending a shiver down their spines. Instantly they set to work, stretching Aris's right arm into position, chaining it to a metal ring on the wall. There was no resistance from Aris, which Taldir found odd, until they stretched his broken arm out, terrifying them with a blood-curdling shriek of pain. Eventually, after a pained struggle, the guards managed to get Aris chained up. Taldir gazed upon his broken form and was almost on the verge of tears. Aris had never been defeated in combat. He was always so strong, and to see his companion this way broke Taldir's heart. But Aris still wouldn't look up. "You were amusing before," Varanis stated as he slivered towards Aris. "But now you bore me. I will get what I want, even if I have to bring in help to do it. I'll be back soon, with much more persuasive means." He chuckled as he turned to leave, clicking his fingers for his subordinates to follow.
"Sir, is it wise to leave these three unguarded?"
A quick scowl put the man back in his place as he cowered in terror. "I have put measures in place so that escape is impossible, even at their strongest. Question me again, and you will share a cell with them," Varanis snapped. The guard said nothing, simply lowering his head. Now satisfied, Varanis' smile reappeared on his face, and he led the way out of the dungeon, the clang of the lock being the last thing the three heard. After a minute or so, Taldir was confident that they were now alone, so he shuffled and dragged himself to the front of the cell, staring at the unmoving man before him. "Aris," he whispered, "what did they do to you? What did they want?" At first, there was nothing, barely the wheeze of his breathing. But then, Aris's head began to move, slowly, shakily, but it moved.
"Taldir, is that you?"
Tears welled up in Taldir's eyes. Aris's voice sounded so thin, so weak. Trying to stifle his sobs, Taldir nodded as Aris's eyes finally met his. "Yes, Aris, it's me," Taldir replied as he began to weep freely. Aris gave a long sigh of relief, and under the dim flicker of the sconces, Taldir thought he could see a brief smile curl into Aris's mouth.
"And the mage, is he still with us?"
Aris asked, stunning the mage, who knew he had not garnered favor with the warrior. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, I'm still here." The mage almost sounded ashamed of himself, seeing what Aris would endure against the enemy. He knew that he could not have lasted through such torture. This man was nobody, just a mercenary. Yet he was a greater warrior than any he'd seen, but more than that, a better mage than he. A scoff sounded from Aris as he attempted to look upon the young mage.
"You are the apprentice of the Archmage, wielding elemental power far above your peers. How is it that you have not attempted to escape?"
Aris asked, his voice coarse and strained. The mage stared at his open hands before clenching them into fists. I couldn't. Something about this place has suppressed my powers, almost choking them. I can't even summon a single flame, or hydrate us with a single drop of water. I'm sorry. I am completely useless here. Disappointment drenched the mage's words. as he leant his head back on the bars of the cell. Even the sconces barely light this darkness. I doubt even the light of Cadros could illuminate this place.
The light of Cadros,
Aris responded, a faint chuckle emanating from his shadowed form. The others looked at him, wide-eyed with confusion, but Aris said nothing more. He did not want to get their hopes up, not without reason. After a few minutes, Aris grunted slightly.
You're right. Even my elemental powers do not work here. I'm guessing that's what he meant about having measures in place. No matter. I have at least one power that he would not have fought to suppress.
With that, he groaned slightly as he concentrated. To the surprise of the others, Aris's wounds began to close and heal, forming scars before vanishing completely. "What are you?" the mage finally asked, in dumbfounded shock and awe. Aris's body was now exactly as it had previously been, without an inkling of what it had been through.
Seeing as we have all the time in the world down here, I guess I might as well tell you something. For now, all you need to know is that I was gifted my powers by the gods for loyal service to them. What you just saw was my healing ability, granted to me by Helena, goddess of life itself.
This prompted an audible gasp from both the mage and Taldir, for even his companion knew little of him. "But the gods haven't been seen in 1,000 years, the mage blurted out, with only a grin and nod being offered by Aris. "But that means you're..."
Yes, they gave me my powers before they left Azura. I was charged with helping the rulers of the country stay on track, maintaining peace and the like.
Aris continued. Taldir seemed struck dumb, ready to faint with the shock. "Why didn't you tell me?" Taldir finally asked. However, Aris shot him an affectionate look before sighing.
Think about it. You already know why I didn't.
Aris assured him, and after a few moments to contemplate his words, Taldir nodded with acknowledgement. "So, what's the plan then?" the mage asked, feeling much more invigorated than before. Aris's face became as stone, unflinching in his resolve.
Varanus needs to die. It's clear to see that he is also gifted, so I think it's time someone turned the tables on him.
A grin curled into Aris's mouth as he clenched his fists.
You might want to close your eyes,
he said as his own shot open, revealing a gleaming white glow. The same glow began to pulse around his body, covering it in a vibrant aura. For a few moments, everything went silent. Aris could feel the fibers in his muscles twitching, his heart pulsing in his chest. He felt the aura envelop him, warming and soothing him. He'd never tapped into this power before, never had a need. It made him feel powerful. As the glow intensified, the pair could no longer bear to look at it. Even with their eyes closed, it was too much, with the two of them having to turn away. With the light came a sound, starting off calming and soothing, but quickly growing to a wail, with Aris's chains clanging violently before creaking as if they were bending and breaking. Eventually, his bond shattered, crashing and scattering across the floor. Taldir and the mage turned back to see Aris in truly magnificent form. Glowing white symbols covered his skin, with his eyes and aura calming to a gentle gold. Aris strode over to the cell doors before throwing the door from its hinges as if it were nothing. With a smile, he placed a hand on each of them, and when he spoke, it almost had an ethereal tone to it.
Now, let's make sure you're both ready to leave.
Aris's hands were warm and radiated the most serene feelings through them both. They looked to each other, their muscles returning to normal, as did their skin color. Both clenched their fists, amazed at the strength they felt. Confidently, they both rose to their feet, with the mage igniting fireballs in his hands effortlessly, unhindered by whatever magic Varanis had cast. "I think it's about time I showed you what I can really do," the mage said, a huge grin sweeping across his face. But Aris turned to him, a question upon his lips.
"First, I would know the name of the man I fight with,"
Aris said, his radiant voice like chimes on the wind. Taldir knew how big a deal this was, and gave the man a huge smile. "Carolinus, my lord," he replied, immediately taking a knee. Aris looked confused at this, gesturing for him to stand. "My lord." It was not a title, but an acknowledgement, a way to show his humility and his repentance. Aris could see this in Carolinus's eyes, but nodded.
"Well then, Carolinus, let us taste freedom once more,"
he said warmly, before turning to Taldir, reaching out and holding his face in his hand. On contact, Taldir brought his hand up, placing it on Aris's, before turning to kiss it affectionately, as tears threatened to fall once again. Once composed, Taldir steeled himself, with Aris turning to the door. First, they'd need to find their armor and weapons. Aris led them, destroying all who got in his way, the light he wielded eviscerating them on impact. At least a dozen had fallen by the time they reached the armory, the most likely place for their effects. This assumption proved correct, as Aris crashed through the armory door, instantly noticing his sword. Before the guards had time to recompose themselves, Aris had already grabbed it, taking off one guard's head with a single swing. By the time Taldir and Carolinus had entered the room, 3 more lay dead, with Aris already reaching for his armor, discarded carelessly in a corner. Within a couple of minutes, the trio were re-equipped, ready to find and slay their captor. Aris had come to the conclusion that they were being held within a fortress, though not a very big one. He recognized it as Iduard architecture of the Western Kingdoms. Through one of the windows, Aris could see the city of Ilanta in the distance, lit up against the night sky, northeast of their position. This meant they were still in Azora, perhaps Bleak Hollow Keep. Through another window, he could see the gleaming towers of Light's Reach to the northwest, which confirmed his theory. If they were to escape, Light's Reach would be the only feasible place to run, though such a thing would be a miracle in itself. Instead, they needed to focus on Varanis. Aris turned to the others, a look of iron determination on his face. Taldir had his sword in one hand and his spear in the other, whilst Carolinus adorned his black robes, both standing ready. The trio cut a bloody path through the fortress. Taldir's spear impaled, his sword cut, whilst Carolinus bathed his opponents in flame, before discarding them with gale-like winds. Aris's sword cut true, but the light was his most righteous weapon, vaporizing his foes where they stood. Eventually, Taldir and Carolinus came to a courtyard, situated outside the main entrance, but Aris was nowhere to be seen. The courtyard was not big, only 100 yards or so from the battlements, but a familiar figure was there to meet them. Varanis. His swords were already drawn, a dozen guards either side of him. "Now, this I did not expect," he said, licking his lips. "But it's too late for you. She is on her way." The pair knew who she was. It was obvious. The Dark Lady Azin. But she is not interested in the two of you. So I'll just eliminate you here. Varanus threw his arms forward, his minions charging for the pair. In a burst of flames, 4 of them already lay dead, which shocked and angered Varanus.
How are you able to use your powers?
He spat angrily. Maybe you're not as powerful as you thought, Carolinus yelled, goading him, provoking him, before using a combination of air and water to launch icy spears at the remaining attackers. Varanus was seething as he turned to Taldir, who nimbly dodged and parried his opponents, taking each one down with ease. But there were still too many. So Carolinus jumped in, peppering the remaining soldiers with fireballs. Furiously, Varanus marched forward, shadow eking from his entire being, his violet eyes glowing wildly. What was your plan? Kill me, then release your friend? I am beyond you. You have no chance against me. You will die, and your friend will fight for me, one way or the other. But before he could reach them, he heard a thud from behind him. He swung around, striking with one of his blades, which was easily blocked. Varanus reeled back in horror as Aris towered over him, his aura of light burning his skin. Feebly, he struck with the other blade, but Aris's free hand grabbed Varanus's arm. With a twist and a crack, both of Varanus's arms were useless, as Aris's glowing eyes burned through his soul. With one hand, Aris grabbed Varanus's face, pouring all of his power through him. Varanus writhed in agony as his veins began to glow white as if he was being purged, his screams becoming louder and more desperate. Eventually, the light was too much for even the other two to keep watching. They covered their eyes as the event reached its climax. The final screams of Varanus became a terrifying shriek, which gave way to a loud blast. When Taldir and Carolinus returned their gaze to Aris, nothing of Varanus remained, other than the skull that he grasped in his hand. With a sense of finality, Aris crushed the skull, casting aside its remnants. Briefly, he looked to his companions before turning to the gate, concern twisting his face.
We need to get going. She's here.